During Lent this year, we have been following Jesus in Jerusalem. And since all the passages that we're using are from one gospel, we can also say that this month we are marching through Mark. We haven't just been confined to Lent, though, in our look at Mark's gospel. We've really basically been there since the beginning of the year. Now, today's passage can remind us of some of the things we've already seen. Now, the woman who takes center stage in this story is much like many of the other characters we visited. The demoniac in the synagogue in Capernaum, the mother-in-law of Peter, the leper Jesus healed, and the man who was lowered from the roof. Like all of them, this woman isn't given a name. She appears like them for but this one incident and then disappears forever. Now, this woman is also like the woman we visited 2 weeks ago. The one who gave her 2 meager coins to the temple treasury. Now, they are similar not only in both being nameless, but because the 2 of them gave everything they had. They both, as Jesus says here about this woman, did what she could. Now, there's something else familiar about this story, something that we've talked about in previous weeks. For this is yet another Mark sandwich. Now, we said that a Mark sandwich is a technique employed by the writer of this gospel whereby he puts something on the top that is similar to something on the bottom with something different right in the middle. And in maintaining the sandwich analogy, it is the meat that's in the middle. And that's really what we have here. For on the top, we've got the deception and the treachery of the religious leaders, and it corresponds on the bottom to the deception and the treachery of Judas Iscariot. And in the middle, in the meat of the sandwich, we've got everything else that's going on here. Now, appropriately, there's a meal. There is this woman and her great act of love. There is the reaction of the disciples, and there is the response of Jesus. I must say, the meat of this sandwich is quite delectable. And we could also switch analogies and look at this woman as a rose between 2 thorns. For Jesus calls what she did a beautiful thing. And it is a rose, contrasted by the thorns that surrounded the ugliness of the conniving religious leaders and the traitorous Judas. So let's take a look. Now, first of all takes place in the home of a man that Mark refers to as Simon the leper. And Jesus is there for a meal, and there are obviously a lot of other people who are present. And what this tells us is that Simon is no longer a leper. Because if he was, his house would not have been full of people. And I think we can reasonably conclude that Simon had been cured of his leprosy by Jesus. And what better way for him to express his gratitude than by having Jesus and his friends in for a meal. And it is this meal of gratitude that really sets the stage for an even greater act of gratitude. For the heart of this story involves this unnamed woman who opens and pours oil on the head of Jesus. And when she does, the disciples are outraged. For this was expensive oil. And we're even told how expensive because one of them says that it could have been sold for 300 denarii. Now, if such a thing were to happen today, we can certainly envision a dozen pockets and purses being opened and gadgets being removed, and we'd have people Googling cost of 6-ounce jar of pistachio nut oil with a splash of spikenard essential oil imported from Nepal. See, that's how we would do it today, and we would know it was worth 300 denarii. Now, I'm not sure how they knew it back then, but it was rather obvious that this was expensive perfume. And how much would 300 denarii have been worth? Well, we're told earlier in Mark's Gospel that it would have been worth a year's salary for an average worker. So we are talking then about thousands upon thousands of dollars here. And when someone suggested that it could have been spent on the poor, we can also look earlier in Mark's Gospel and we can see that 200 denarii would have been sufficient to feed a crowd of 5,000 people. So do the math. This perfume poured on the head of Jesus by this unnamed woman in the home of Simon the healed leper could have fed 7,500 people. What an outrageous waste. If we are honest with ourselves, we would have to agree with those who objected to what this woman has done. Those who were there that day knew the plight of the poor. For the poor of Palestine were really poor. Now, they were nothing like the poor in our own country who have the benefit of at least some kind of social safety net. Now, the disciples and anyone else dining in Simon's house that day were keenly aware of the poverty that they could not fail to see all around them, and the staggering value of the perfume that was, in their minds, wasted on the head of one man. You see, these people were Israelites. They knew their Hebrew Bible. And they also knew that the first responsibility of Israel's king, back in the Old Testament times when Israel still had a king, the first responsibility of that king was to safeguard the poor. The first responsibility of political as well as religious authority was to safeguard the poor. That in itself has, I believe, profound implications for our own day. And so we can certainly understand why the disciples were upset. What this woman has done. Now, I think it's interesting, though, that they never seem to give a thought to something else this woman might have done with this oil. But they never even seem to consider who else may have benefited from this precious oil. And maybe you haven't considered it either. But think about it. Who is the most obvious person to benefit from this very expensive perfume? Why not the woman herself? It's hers. They say, why doesn't she just keep it and use it herself? She can use it for the rest of her life. Or why not sell it for some outrageous price and take a triple lifetime? Or why not sell it and buy that dream house that she has always wanted? Why should anyone else, either Jesus or the poor, get what is rightfully hers? And so when you think about it like that, when you think that an alternative use for it would have been to benefit this woman herself, it puts this act in a completely different perspective, doesn't it? You see, is it going to be me? Or is it going to be Jesus? What will be the focus of my life? Am I going to be centered on me? Or am I going to be centered on God? Because you see, I think the argument that is used here by those who are outraged is really just a smokescreen. For as Jesus says, you always have the poor with you. Oh, but more importantly, he says you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. So you see, the contrast here is not between Jesus and the poor. No, the contrast is between always and not always. It's exactly what Jesus says. Opportunities to help the poor will always be present. But opportunities to bless Jesus will, as he says, not always be available. So you see, this woman took advantage of what little time was left. No, if she chose, and if the disciples chose, they could spend the rest of their lives feeding the poor, reaching out to help those in need. What the disciples have done here, though, is presented an illogical pair of options. And they're saying, you should do this and not do that. Now, why can't it be both? Why do we have to either honor Jesus or feed the poor? Now, for those of you who have determined to refrain from giving gifts at holidays, birthdays, and instead offer a donation to some worthy cause in the name of a loved one, I applaud you. And I also hope you won't be offended by this story that I'm about to tell you. It's a story about little Mandy. She was excited when her Aunt Betty called to say that she was coming over to bring her a present for her birthday. And Mandy hoped that it would be that very special doll that she wanted so badly. But when her aunt arrived, all she had was an envelope. And after her initial disappointment, Mandy thought maybe there would be a gift card inside to purchase the doll. But when she opened the envelope, she found a certificate inside saying, a gift has been given in your name to feed starving children in the world. And Mandy very politely thanked her aunt for being so thoughtful. And later that night, as her mother was putting her to bed, Mandy said, I'm really glad that Aunt Betty cares about starving children in the world, but I still wish I had my God. You see, I think that's the bottom line of what Jesus is saying here. We should always care about the poor, but that doesn't preclude us from extravagantly loving other people, our own family members who are loving Jesus as well. In fact, the two really should always go hand in hand. Well, one thing about this passage, though, that is most remarkable is the outrageousness of this woman's actions. In the garden area behind the Red Geranium in New Harmony, where Paul Tillich is buried, there are stones all through that garden area that have quotes of the great theologian Tillich emblazoned upon them. Now here's one that's not there, but it really could be. It's from a sermon that Paul Tillich preached on this passage. He said, without the abundance of the heart, nothing great can happen. Religion, within the limits of reasonableness, is a mutilated religion. And calculating love is not love at all. And when was the last time you did something as outrageous as what this woman did? And when was the last time you allowed your love for Jesus Christ to enable you to do something that went beyond all bounds of reasonable thinking? You see, so often in life, we are prisoners of logic. We're prisoners of reason. We are prisoners of practicality. And I'm afraid the older we get, the more true that is. I think that's one reason that so many of us find it so much fun to be around children. Whether it's our own children, whether it's our grandchildren, whether it's a little kid next door, or whether it's our own church children. So many of us love to be around children because it's just so much fun. It's just so much fun to get down on the floor and roll around, to play games with our imagination and to act in outrageously impractical ways. And I think that's why Jesus loved children so much. And I think that's why he told us that if we are serious about entering the kingdom of God, we must again ourselves become like children. Or just think of the possibilities that exist for us if we as adults act in outrageous and impractical ways. I used to have a poster in my office. There's a quote on it from George Bernard Shaw. The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one persists in adapting the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends upon the unreasonable man. You see, the woman in this story was unreasonable. She was outrageous. She was impractical, and she was illogical. And in her love and commitment to Jesus Christ, she went far beyond the bounds of rational thought and reasonable, normal behavior. And she is contrasted here not only with the disciples who disapproved of her extravagance, but with the religious leaders and with Judas. She is indeed a rose between two thorns. And 2,000 years later, we remember those thorns. We remember the treachery of those religious leaders, and we remember the betrayal of Judas. But we also remember this beautiful rose, who did something outrageous, something unreasonable, something impractical, something illogical. As Jesus said, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her. Now, when was the last time you did something so unreasonable, so outrageous, so impractical, and so illogical that others would remember it long after you were gone? I think the capabilities, the opportunities, and the possibilities are around us every single day. Why not think about that this week? Why not be a rose? Do something unreasonable. Do something outrageous. Do something beautiful for Jesus. Amen.